understanding Indigenous and non-Indigenous theories of wellbeing and assessing their suitability for public policy to promote wellbeing. This project was funded by the Flinders Foundation under a health seeding grant of 2019. The research team consisted of Associate Professor Tamara Mackean, Dr. Matt Fisher, Roland Wilson and Madison Shakespeare. This presentation is created and presented by Madison Shakespeare, and it reflects policy considerations discussed in Theories of Indigenous and Non-Indigenous Wellbeing in Australian Health Policies of 2020. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands Flinders University teaches across. I also acknowledge the traditional owners with whom I have the privilege of working with, learning from, learning with, and presenting to today. Dr. Matt Fisher presented part 1 of our overall presentation of the research that we engaged in. He looked at methods that we employed, which included working at the interface between knowledge systems, regular yarning sessions, and a scoping review of literature wherein theoretical considerations of well-being were examined. Traditional and contemporary non-Indigenous theoretical definitions of well-being were tabled, and Indigenous theoretical definitions of well-being were identified. In the second part of our presentation, I will look at the policy review process that we engaged in. We're going to begin by looking at document analysis, theories of wellbeing in Australian health policy. When looking at what documents were selected, we first engaged in searches involving terms mental health, wellbeing, and Aboriginal. We searched across titles of current strategic level health policies of state, territory, and federal governments. 28 policies were selected. We then conducted a further search wherein we searched terms strategic plan, health plan, and/or health framework in their title. 6 policies were identified and chosen. A total of 34 policies were selected for analysis, 10 of which were directed specifically toward improving Indigenous health, mental health, and/or wellbeing outcomes. The remaining 24 policies were directed toward the population at large. This table identifies each policy that we reviewed and relied upon. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policies are annotated in red. 2 specific methods were employed when analysing the health policies. Qualitative data analysis software, NVivo 12, was utilised to systematically collate key thematic components. We initially applied an a priori thematic coding framework that contains 7 main thematic categories. As a result of what we found and what we listed in NVivo, we then devised a tabulated discourse analysis checklist. This provided a beneficial, very valuable bird's eye view of differing degrees to which each policy reflected elements central to our research. Some of the categories that were included in our discourse analysis checklist examine specifics of social determinants of health, specific categories of social determinants of Indigenous health, aspects of differences in theories of well-being, and other cultural considerations. Ethical clearance was not required for this specific research. I'd like to give you a brief overview of definitions of well-being that occurred across these health policies that we reviewed. There's a dominant trend, biomedical and/or individualised behavioural meanings arose. Most policies also at times used the term wellbeing as an addendum to health and/or mental health. It was not uncommon for the term wellbeing to either be not defined or ill-defined. When wellbeing was not defined, it was merely paired with other terms. An example of this is in an ACT policy. I am excited about this policy's potential to improve the health and well-being of Canberrans and transform our already high-quality health system into a modern, person-centred health system. Around 2/3 of the policies frequently defined positive health or well-being, either explicitly defined or implicitly inferred, in biomedical terms, as the absence of disease, or in behavioural terms, to do with individuals adopting healthy behaviours. Use of quantitative health data in policies was also focused predominantly on biomedical and/or behavioural measures, therein reinforcing these views of health and well-being. A direct outcome of employing thematic coding and utilising in vivo software was that we identified that we needed to look further into data that was relied upon across these health policies. One example is a national mental health plan. Commitments in this 5th plan aim to result in better physical health for Australians with mental illness. They identified an indicator of well-being, connectedness and meaning in life. A data quantified outcome. But the same health policy stated that data was not gathered, thus disenabling strategies that supported realising this aim. Quantitative data was frequently used to highlight health inequities affecting First Nations peoples. But more often than not, it represented them as deficient in both biomedical and behavioural concepts of health, therein not realising holistic notions of well-being, which must be realised are central to well-being of Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. One policy relied on data obtained from a supplementary document, but misquoted the figures. The report that was relied upon quoted 5.5%. However, the health policy quoted 55%. This was specifically in regard to Aboriginal young people who are under supervision in terms of probation and parole corrective services, youth offenders. Profound danger, negative implications arise because of this typo. This typo misrepresents figures of young people, Indigenous young people in custody and under supervision, and therein potentially doing more harm by reinforcing negative stereotypes. When considering notions of well-being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the health policies that we examined, all 10 Indigenous specific policies construe well-being holistically. 6 of those 10 policies endorse the Gayaadui Proud Spirit Declaration. It's noted and discussed in the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership in Mental Health 2015 document. There were many diverse representations, political elements in definitions of well-being that addressed ongoing impact of colonisation on First Nations peoples, Indigenous rights and principles of self-determination, and community control. An example is in a national policy. It states culture and cultural identity is critical to social and emotional well-being, individual and community control over their physical environment, respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's rights, and a perception of just and fair treatment is also important to social and emotional well-being. When further exploring holistic notions of well-being across our health policies that we chose, when looking specifically at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, a Victorian policy presents a holistic model of Aboriginal social and emotional well-being that is detailed on this slide, and it emphasises the relationality and integrating personal, spiritual, cultural, communitarian and ecological elements. What was of particular interest also is that across our health policies for whole population health, non-Indigenous views of well-being at times resonated with the holistic nature of Indigenous theory and used Indigenous concepts or recognised values such as social justice. When looking specifically at this excerpt from the South Australian policy, our vision is that South Australia takes a whole of person, whole of life, whole of government and whole of community approach to building, sustaining and strengthening mental health and well-being. Whilst it is acknowledged that some of the whole population health policies construe well-being more broadly and even at times use terms that align with Indigenous considerations of well-being that are more holistic, it's important to consider relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous views of well-being and the extent to which these common holistic considerations occur. Recognition of Indigenous views of well-being within the policies analysed was almost always represented as relevant only to Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people. However, the more general non-Indigenous views of well-being identified did sometimes include points that align partially with the spiritual, social, relational and ecological elements of Indigenous views. I provided a couple of examples here. Look at a Victorian, the fourth Victorian policy that was analysed. High levels of mental well-being have been found to be associated with increased learning, creativity and productivity, more pro-social behaviours and positive social relationships. South Australian policy, we are increasing our connection to nature and open spaces through our Healthy Parks, Healthy People SA approach, Nature Play SA and the Adelaide International Bird Sanctuary. Another Victorian policy, all Victorians must have opportunities to share, celebrate, mourn and heal and collectively be able to value and embrace Aboriginal culture, knowledge and heritage. And the same South Australian policy also goes on to say well-being is shaped by the complex relationship between many factors. This includes climate change, connection to country, justice and inclusiveness, trade, human migration and displacement. As outlined, while there are points of connection, such points of connection was still the exception. But what is indicated is that there is a potential for theoretical integration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous views. Such a change in policy would require a resolving of a basic conceptual difference between two kinds of theory. There would need to be greater recognition in policy of the value of Indigenous concepts of wellbeing for broader public wellbeing. Although non-Indigenous views of wellbeing often do acknowledge the significance of social environments, they continue to define wellbeing itself as a property of individuals. This occurs at times across policies when wellbeing is conceptualised as absence of disease, as choice of healthy behaviours, when described and defined and/or considered in context to subjective states and/or through personal attributes. In the policies we examined, it was only the Indigenous theories that consistently expressed a genuinely relational view of wellbeing, constituted in a state of harmonious interrelatedness between individual, family, community, culture, and country, or consistently included political principles such as rights and social justice. We conclude that public policy interest in wellbeing is welcome and necessary. However, although the terminology of wellbeing is widespread in Australian health policy, effective policy for Indigenous and non-Indigenous wellbeing is likely to be limited by continued dominance of biomedical and behavioural strategies and measures, individualised concepts of wellbeing, failure to convert Indigenous theories of wellbeing into culturally relevant, strength-based strategies, and failure to draw on Indigenous understandings of wellbeing to inform strategies for broader public wellbeing. The national effort to improve the health of Indigenous Australians is vital and must continue apace, with the driving principle of a holistic view of Indigenous health as being not just the physical well-being of the individual, but the social, emotional and cultural well-being of the whole community. This is a whole-of-life view, and it also includes the cyclical concept of life, death, life.